Palestinians.
Welcome back to another crucial discussion. This time, Miko Peled is stepping up to speak the truth. If you're unfamiliar with Miko, here's a quick overview. He's a former Israeli soldier, born into a family that supported Israel's creation and its military. But here's the twist. He changed. He took a hard look at the injustice in Palestine and chose to speak out against the apartheid system his own people created. What makes his voice so powerful isn't just his knowledge, it's his perspective. He's Jewish. Many raised to support the system lacked the courage to speak up, but Miko did. Now he's using his platform to expose the horrors in Palestine. This video is a must-watch. Miko isn't here to sugarcoat anything. He's calling it like it is, highlighting the double standards, the crimes of genocide, and the ongoing oppression. We're dealing with a system that's been in place for decades, yet we continue pretending it's all about peace talks and solutions. But as Miko points out, the real conversation needs to focus on dismantling apartheid and fighting for a free Palestine. It's brutal, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. So if you want to hear the truth, hit that like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. We need more people questioning the narrative, and your voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here and so many people outside. Do you hear the chanting outside? Hear them? So perhaps the motion should have been phrased differently. What separates us from them? It's not a legal definition. It's not a particular law. It's values. I'll give you an example. Let's assume that Hamas has a base under a hospital with missiles. Let's assume that Hamas is the devil. Never mind Hamas. The devil is there. Does it justify harming a child? Does it justify harming a child? Does it justify killing a civilian? This is where you draw the line. Somebody talked here about red lines. And this speaks to the young lady that spoke here just a minute ago. It's a question of values. If it means harming the hair on the head of a child, you do not do it. That's it. That is, sit down. That is the difference between the two sides. They say, kill the child, kill 1,000 children, kill 100,000 children. We say, you do not harm a child. That's the difference. That's what this is about. And that leads us to the next step in this argument. Terrorism. What is terrorism? What is heroism? How do we define them? I'm often asked, as many of my colleagues here, do you condemn the Palestinians? Do you condemn the Palestinians? And I'm sure many of you have had these conversations, or at least heard these conversations. Do you condemn the Palestinians in Gaza? The Gaza Strip is a concentration camp that was created by the Zionists almost as soon as the Zionist apartheid state was established. It was created by them as a concentration camp into which they herded hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the southern part of Palestine as the ethnic cleansing campaign was going along. It's a concentration camp. Palestinians have been living in that concentration camp for more than 7 decades. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance to the apartheid, to the ethnic cleansing, to the massacres, to the killing, has been unarmed. The Gaza concentration camp, pre-October 7, this was a luxury. This was a luxury. The idea that there would be a glass of water half full and there would be no need, no sense of urgency to drink it. This was a luxury. So then, after decades upon decades of existing within this concentration camp and Israeli terrorist attacks, massive massacres in the Gaza Strip, in the Gaza concentration camp, which began, by the way, almost as soon as the concentration camp was created. Massacres upon massacres. Every year, the weapons become more effective. Different weapon systems, more dead and more dead and more dead. For decades. Then on October the 7th of last year, Palestinian fighters came out of this concentration camp, one of the poorest and most oppressed regions in the world. They came by air, they came by sea, they came by land. They showed once again that the entire Israeli military apparatus, the entire Israeli intelligence apparatus is no more than a paper tiger. They practically liberated half of Palestine. They took over 20 Israeli settlements. They took over a massive military base. They disrupted the apartheid state. They shut it down. And we're out there protesting, many of us. What is the call? If we don't get justice, shut it down. They shut it down. They paralyzed the apartheid state. That's what we've been calling for. And they did exactly what was called for. Sit down, not now. Not now, sit down. No. I said no. I said no.
It's important to take a moment to reflect on what has been said. And let's be real here. What has been said, what has been laid out, is undeniable. For far too long, we've turned a blind eye to the suffering that's been ongoing in Palestine. So let's not kid ourselves. The world knows what's happening, and yet here we are, having to justify the basic right to live for an entire population. Isn't it exhausting? And here's where Miko Peled enters the scene like a modern-day superhero. Now, I know what you're thinking. A superhero in a debate about Palestine and Israel? Yes. And it's not because he wears a cape or flies through the air. It's because he speaks the truth, the brutal, unfiltered truth that we'd rather not face. Miko Peled has become a symbol of what it means to stand alone, armed only with integrity and a refusal to bow down to the status quo. When everyone else cowers behind convenient narratives and political interests, Peled stands firm, calling out the systemic violence, the apartheid, the genocide. And let's not forget, he's been fighting this battle in the most public of arenas, against not just the Israeli establishment, but also against the global apathy that seems to define our time. That, my friends, is what makes him a superhero. You see, Miko Peled isn't just an academic or a political figure. He's a voice for the oppressed. He dares to say what needs to be said, even when it costs him personally. This isn't about winning arguments or gaining applause. This is about confronting the uncomfortable reality of injustice head on. And when the world stands still, when the international community does little more than watch as lives are destroyed, Peled raises his voice. He doesn't just speak for himself, but for every Palestinian who has been silenced, for every life lost without a second thought, for every individual who's been reduced to a statistic. So, why is Miko Peled a superhero? Because he fights, not with weapons or force, but with truth. And that is the greatest weapon of all. He understands that the key to ending this madness is not more violence, not more suffering, but the dismantling of an apartheid system that has been allowed to exist for far too long. If the world had the courage to follow his lead, we might just see a glimmer of hope. A hope that doesn't come from war or bloodshed, but from justice. A hope that doesn't require silence, but loud, unrelenting voices that refuse to be ignored. And before we wrap up, let's not forget the essential point Peled made. We're not just talking about definitions here. This isn't about legalities, about technicalities. This is about values. It's about having the courage to ask the tough questions, to expose the uncomfortable truths and to demand accountability. In the end, it's not about where you stand legally. It's about what kind of world you want to live in. A world that turns a blind eye, or a world that stands for justice, for truth, and for the sanctity of life. Miko Peled's fight is far from over, and as much as some would like to ignore or dismiss him, he is one of the few brave enough to carry the torch. So the question remains, will we choose to follow the path of justice, or will we continue to allow injustice to reign? The choice is ours. Thank you.
They paralyzed the apartheid state.
Speaker to wait until I had a point of order. This is not a point of
No, he
information.
said
Yeah.
that. He didn't say a point of order. He said something about terrorism. Just leave it.
I apologize. Can the speaker please proceed?
They paralyzed the apartheid state.
Excuse me. Please state your point of order. Please state your point of order.
Is the speaker glorifying terrorism?
This is not a point of order. The speaker will proceed. It's not a point of order. A point of order can only be made.
I'm happy. I will.
Speaker, please proceed.
Terrorism is what followed the vengeance, the sadistic cruelty of the Israeli response is terrorism. What Palestinians have been living through is terrorism. I'm happy. No. Terrorism is what Palestinians have been experiencing since the apartheid state was established. That is terrorism. Kibbutz Be'eri was one of the settlements that was taken. It was in the news.
I apologize to the speaker. I have to raise.
May you please remind the opposition that this is not the West Bank and they do not have the right to, order us around or threaten us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Point of order.
You know, I will respond to that being a privileged Israeli, when I'm in the West Bank, I'm not bossed around. This only applies to Palestinians. In the apartheid state, I am on the privileged side. So thank you for that, but it does not apply to me. The issue of Kibbutz Be'eri. I grew up, I had relatives on Kibbutz Be'eri, so I used to go there in summers and on holidays. And it's 3 or 4 kilometers from the Gaza concentration camp. My entire youth, I would go there, play with my cousins. Never once, not even once had anybody talked about the fact that there's a concentration camp 3 kilometers away. Not once. Not once did anybody talk about the fact that the people who live in that concentration camp, their land was stolen, their water was stolen. We are on their land. We have taken their resources. People say the Naqab is a desert. It's nothing. The Naqab is a desert that was inhabited by Palestinian Bedouin who are farmers. The reason the Israeli settlements in the Naqab are so successful, are so prosperous, is because the land there is prosperous. Not once did anybody ever mention the fact that we stole that land and it belongs to the people over there. And by the way, why are they living in a concentration camp? People would ask from time to time, what's wrong with these Arabs? Why do they live in such crowded areas? Why is it so crowded in the Gaza Strip? What's wrong with them? Nothing is wrong with them. What's wrong is the apartheid state. And by the way, the definition of the crime of genocide was largely as a result of the genocide of the Jews in Europe. I'm reading Raphael Lemkin, who coined the phrase genocide right now. 3 years after the end of the genocide of the Jews in Europe, this country, along with many others, allowed for a genocide to take place in Palestine, allowed for an apartheid regime to take place in Palestine, and allowed for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Palestine. 3 short years after the end of the genocide of the Jews and the definition, the creation of this new law, of this new definition of the crime of genocide.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a shock it is to see a room full of people listening to Miko Peled. I say shock not because he's a bad speaker, far from it, but because we live in a world where the obvious truth gets drowned out by ignorance, silence, and cowardice. You just heard one of the most passionate, well-informed voices in the fight for justice. And yet, here we are, debating whether the words spoken tonight should even be uttered. But don't worry, because Miko is not just talking to you. He's talking to your conscience, your values. And if it makes you uncomfortable, well, that's probably because your values are where the problem lies. Let's take a moment and digest what we've heard. A man stands before us who doesn't just speak with knowledge, He speaks with the kind of raw, personal passion that comes from living through the unthinkable. A man who lost his own niece to the hands of terror and could easily let anger cloud his reasoning. But instead of descending into hatred, what does Miko Peled do? He rises above, cuts through the fog of vengeance, and lays bare the ultimate truth. It's not Hamas, it's not the militants, it's not the terrorists. It's the systematic denial of basic human dignity. Miko doesn't have to be here, ladies and gentlemen. He could easily have stayed silent like so many others, but he doesn't. Why? Because the truth doesn't just hurt, it burns. It burns like the relentless suffering of millions of Palestinians in an open-air prison. It burns because the world watches, does nothing, and then has the audacity to call it self-defense when a nation bombs and kills indiscriminately year after year under the guise of security. And yet, here you are, some of you probably shifting in your seats, wondering if Miko's message is too harsh. Is it too much, too blunt, too real? Maybe you find it hard to look at, hard to listen to, hard to feel. And I understand. It's much easier to bury your head in the sand and tell yourself that everything's fine. After all, when you have the luxury of privilege, it's all too easy to dismiss the pain of those who suffer. But don't let that make you a coward. Miko Peled, this incredible man, is a hero, but not in the way the media will tell you. No, he's a hero because he dares to say the unspeakable. A hero not because he fights with weapons, but because he fights with truth. And when your enemies, no matter how strong, how vocal, or how armed, are so entrenched in lies, truth becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. So what do we do with this truth? What do we do with the knowledge that people, real people, are being slaughtered, displaced, and erased from the map simply because their existence doesn't fit the narrative that those in power want to maintain? What do we do with the sickening hypocrisy of those who preach peace while locking an entire people behind bars, turning their lives into nothing more than a footnote in history? The cynical reality is that the so-called powers that be don't want peace. They want silence. They want to bury the truth, dismiss the narratives of oppression, and continue to feed us the lies that prop up a broken system. Miko is here tonight to show you what real courage looks like. Real courage is not bowing down to power. It's standing tall and refusing to be intimidated into submission. Real courage is calling out the grotesque, morally bankrupt double standards that plague this world. And Miko Peled, by all rights, should be living in peace. But instead, he is thrust into a battle for truth, a battle where the stakes could not be higher. He doesn't need this. He doesn't need to be here telling us things we already know deep down. He doesn't need to risk being vilified, labeled a traitor, a terrorist sympathizer, or worse. But here he is, telling the truth, because that's what a hero does. Miko Peled isn't just speaking against injustice in Palestine. He is speaking against all injustice, against all the systems that perpetuate suffering while cloaking themselves in the veil of righteousness, against the false narratives that silence the voices of the oppressed. So next time, before you dare to question Miko's words, ask yourself, why is it so hard to face the truth when it's staring you in the face? And why does standing up for humanity make someone a radical while staying silent makes you a part of the problem? Ladies and gentlemen, as you leave here tonight, ask yourselves, are you willing to stand with the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you? Because Miko Peled is doing exactly that. And if that doesn't make him a hero, then I don't know what does.
The motion is not about this law or that law. The motion is about values. That's what it's about. It's about double standard. That's the difference between the two sides here. You know, my first debate about the issue of apartheid actually took place in South Africa. I was in South Africa maybe 10 years ago. And I was invited to an interview, a kind of a debate between myself and an Israeli Zionist who was brought for that purpose. And we're sitting there, and the host, who was a black South African, asked me, so how is Israel an apartheid state? Which, of course, was very easy to explain. And I did. And then he looked over at the other guest and he said, how is it not an apartheid state? And the other person opened his mouth and for maybe 30 seconds did not utter a word. And 30 seconds on live television is like hours. He had nothing to say. He had nothing to say, because it's an apartheid state. So I don't know what is worse for, sit down. I don't know what is worse for the Zionists, the gaping mouth of that one Zionist, or these people sitting here trying to justify and excuse and pretend that there is no apartheid. So I find myself here, quite frankly, honored to be here at this very respectable forum, but I'm also extremely saddened, like my brother Muhammad, that we are still discussing this after almost 8 decades of these heinous crimes perpetrated against the Palestinians. That we're still debating this, rather than debating how quickly we can dismantle apartheid and how quickly we can allow for a free, democratic Palestine to be established from the river to the sea. That's the conversation that we should be having. I'm saddened by the fact that my Palestinian sisters and brothers still have to see their families, their people, their nation being exterminated by the Zionist state. Weapons coming from here, weapons coming from the United States, diplomatic cover, and very little being done to stop it. And I'm also, I have to say, very saddened to see Palestinians sitting here who have been reduced to becoming traitors and collaborators with their own oppressors, with the Zionist oppressors. So let me read a few things for you. We talked about apartheid, yes or no. From the this is from the Amnesty report that came out almost 3 years ago. Whether they live in Gaza, Jerusalem, the West Bank, or what they call Israel, which is 1948 Palestine, Palestinians are treated as an inferior group and systematically deprived of their rights. The international community has an obligation to act. This room has an obligation to act. This is not a theory. This is not a theoretical academic conversation. There's a responsibility, an obligation to act to end the crime, the heinous crime of apartheid. And there are recommendations at the end of the report, which include sanctions, arms embargo, and the freezing of assets of the Zionist apartheid state. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Francesca Albanese, recently published reports on apartheid where she calls it the anatomy of genocide. The violence that Israel has unleashed against the Palestinians post-October 7 is not happening in a vacuum, but is part of a long-term, intentional, systematic, state-organized forced displacement and replacement of the Palestinian people. This trajectory risks causing irreparable prejudice to the very existence of the people of Palestine. The nature of the scale of Israel's assault on Gaza and the destructive conditions of life it has inflicted reveal, are you ready for this? Pay attention, reveals an intent to physically destroy Palestinians as a group. There's no question there's genocide taking place. There's no question that apartheid, the crime of apartheid, is being perpetrated. There's no question that ethnic cleansing is taking place. In the recommendations, by the way, the rapporteur suggests immediately implementing an arms embargo, reparations, and to apply the Geneva Convention. I'm almost done. Once again, the way this House votes today will demonstrate this House's values. It's not about a legal definition. It's about values. Somebody mentioned the possibility of peace. There is a possibility for peace. I have no doubt about it. I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't firmly and completely believe in the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The road to peace in Palestine, the path to peace in Palestine is dismantling the apartheid state. And in order to do that, of course, sanctions have to be applied. And then the establishment of a free democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. Vote and show and demonstrate what side you're on, what values you uphold. Thank you.